Headlines this week, giving the EU the respect they deserve by making fun of them just like anybody else. The grand finale, here we go with the headlines, starting with good news, bad news. The hot topics this week are net neutrality and TTIP. But before we get to that, the EU Commission, the one-word who's who, one-word reactions to all 28 new EU commissioners. It's a high bar we've set, people, but we're going to try it. This week, the other 14, starting with, start the clock, research, science, and innovation. That's this guy. One word, anticlimax. The EU just landed a space probe on a speeding comet. How are you going to top that? Transport. When word, boring. High-speed rail, very nice, but not as sexy as landing a probe on a comet. Next, neighborhood policy and enlargement. Boring. Enlargement into what? Turkey? They don't want us. Ukraine? No fucking way. Next, agriculture and rural development. Subsidies. Farm subsidies are killing the EU, but is Phil Hogan going to change them? Don't hold your breath. Next, health and food safety. One word, Monsanto. In terms of threats to food safety, the biggest enemy is us. Energy union is next. One word, pipeline. Of course, energy union could mean energy independence, but this guy's poor mandate is to keep that Russian gas a-pumping. The next three ministers or commissioners, let's call them physician heal thyself, starting with international cooperation and development. Croatia. Who better to help cooperation than the country that's split off from the rest? And humanitarian and crisis management, in a word, Cyprus. Who better to hand out crisis aid than the country that could use some crisis aid? Cyprus. First put the mask on Greece, then yourself. Next, justice, consumers, and gender equality. One word, sausage party. Who better to facilitate gender equality than an EU commission that is 70% men? Then again, Vera is ready for business. Hell hath no fury, like a female Czech justice minister scorned. Next, digital single market. Here we go, people. Untrustworthy. Estonia, the land that brought us Skype, is supposed to protect net neutrality, making sure that the internet remains free. But here's what Andrus had to say on net neutrality. Higher prices for higher speeds would be acceptable. In other words, all internet is created equal, but some more equal than others. Next, digital economy. I think Andres is going to be bumping heads with this guy, Oettinger, as the departing departing energy union commissioner. He personally brokered a deal, a heating gas deal with Putin and Poroshenko from Ukraine. Badass. So far, this guy has said net neutrality is non-negotiable, and he's German, so you better believe rules are rules. Next up, there are three more commissioners left, and that brings us to this week's good news, bad news. The bad news is, this week, the whole EU Commission started off on the defensive. There were the LuxLeaks Luxembourg tax policy documents leaked, aimed at the president, Jean-Claude Juncker. Good news is, Juncker gave a big mea culpa, saying he's here to set things right. Bad news, it was like a week late and half-assed, just justifying every Eurosceptic's case that the EU is a pro-business old boys network. Well, the good news, it ain't just old boys. Enter Denmark's Margrethe Vestager. In a word, trustbuster. Good news, she entered her office with 3 cases on her desk. Apple in Ireland, Starbucks in the Netherlands, and Fiat in Luxembourg. Luxembourg. That was no accident. And Vestager got to work. Last week, her office announced that Netherlands' huge tax breaks for Starbucks amount to a government subsidy. Why would the EU subsidize an American multinational? Exactly. Good news for Starbucks is they might be able to avoid huge fines. Bad news, well, they'll probably do that by paying years of back taxes. Good news for the EU, bad news for Apple and Fiat, but we're not out of the woods yet. The other huge item on the desk is TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Pact. Good news is such a free trade area would provide a much needed boost for the euro economy. Bad news is you've probably never heard of TTIP until right now. Have you? Which in itself is not such bad news, except you know who has heard of TTIP? Big business and corporate lobbyists who are quietly busy with consumer unfriendly ideas such as ISDS. More bad news. If you haven't heard of TTIP, you definitely haven't heard of ISDS, the Investor-State Dispute Settlement, otherwise known as the right to sue, as in the right of companies to sue the government for enforcing the law. For example, in Canada, Eli Lilly was denied 2 patents for pills showing no beneficial medical effect, and now the drug company gets to sue Canada for $500 million in lost revenue. El Salvador, a Canadian company, was denied a gold mine that would contaminate the water supply, so now El Salvador is being sued for $315 million in lost revenue. And the biggest stakes of all, in Ecuador, an American oil company was denied a drilling site in the Amazon rainforest, so now they get to sue Ecuador for $2.3 billion in lost revenue. And they won! The good news is, there are independent courts and judges, of course, bringing fairness to these proceedings. Bad news, these proceedings are basically held in private. It's just 4 white guys appointed by lobbyist-dominated subcommittees. That is the deal that they're trying to write into the TTIP trade agreement. Good news is there's a new trade commissioner on the block from Sweden, Celia Malmström. Before she was even appointed, she told the EU Parliament, "You'd better not vote for me if you like this right to sue provision, because that's a deal breaker." To recap, good news, if you pay attention, as this story develops and shows support for Malmström, then we might not get stuck with a crappy consumer unfriendly deal. The bad news is, you know you won't pay attention. Prove me wrong. That leaves just one more commissioner: education, culture, youth, and sport. How to describe him in a word? Hungarian. I mean, they had to give Hungary something. And now the guy in charge of European culture is from the government that wants to ban the internet. Which brings us to an element of Dutch culture that is getting more interesting on a European scale. Yes, we're going to talk